So, I am no stranger to controversy. In fact, the entire stated goal of videos like these is to take concepts and explain the nuance behind them, in order to combat this debate bro culture in which fallacies are used like buzzwords. And as such, in the past, I've gone over how false equivalence, for example, is not a logical fallacy. As most sources state, it is just something that the internet made up. And more than that, it just has no logical basis behind it. And hearing that made the internet very mad. But I'm about to outdo myself, because whereas false equivalence was something that the internet made up, probably taking it from Noam Chomsky's false balance, there is a much older concept that is more well-known and probably thought to be more academically vetted that is considered a logical fallacy, but is not. And yes, if you've put two and two together, I'm talking about circular reasoning. Circular reasoning is not really a logical fallacy, nor is begging the question. Which, despite this introduction, isn't to say that either one of these is not an important concept. They are. As we will get to, it is just that they are important in very specific ways that often get overlooked, and as a result of that, lead to their misclassification, and in some rare circumstances, their misuse. So, in order to understand the nature of circular reasoning, before we even explain what circular reasoning is, it's important to have a general understanding of philosophy as a whole. So first, let's cover some important distinctions in the branches of philosophy and major concepts in debate. The ones that are important to this video include, obviously, logic, but also rhetoric, ontology, epistemology, and dialectics. What follows are probably vast oversimplifications that I have to make for the sake of brevity, but rhetoric, for example, is the discipline concerned with whether or not an argument is persuasive. Likewise, dialectics, in a classical or pre-Hegelian sense, is just an argument that flows more like a discussion in which both parties are trying to find the truth. And ontology is the branch of philosophy concerned with being. So, for the purposes of this video, I will be talking about what is true of reality, which is contrasted with epistemology, the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge claims and how we can claim that we know statements about reality are true. Diving into why these concepts are relevant here, let's start with logic. More specifically, let's start by acknowledging that logic can be further divided into various subcategories, of which we really only need to talk about formal and informal logic, because logical fallacies are said to either belong to formal fallacies or informal fallacies. Formal fallacies are flaws in form. Informal fallacies are flaws in context or content. In either case, a valid or cogent argument should tell us that something is true or likely true. This means that something is a logical fallacy when, due to a flaw in its form or content, it fails to prove a conclusion. So the question becomes, how does circular reasoning fail to prove a conclusion? Well, circular reasoning is a type of argument in which you end where you begin, much like a circle, hence circular reasoning. The shortest way to do this is to simply repeat a proposition as both a premise and a conclusion. Generally, this is done in a somewhat deceptive way. For example, I could say that my philosophy channel is the best philosophy channel on YouTube because there are none greater. In this, I have essentially said, my channel is the best because it is the best. This, when a circular argument chain is of length 1 or 0, however you want to count it, is usually referred to as begging the question. I think, however, FYI, there may be those who argue that begging the question refers to something more specific in Aristotelian dialectics, but I think this video is already long enough without going over the history of the hyper-specific things that this term used to mean or does mean. Just in general, that's what it means, and with that preface out of the way, why do some people say that circular reasoning is a fallacy, and why do I say that it is not? Well, I think it's easier to understand both perspectives when we acknowledge what we both agree to be true. As far as I'm aware, nobody claims that circular reasoning is a formal fallacy, which honestly may seem a bit strange. And I think that only helps to lend credence to my conclusion. You would think that an alleged fallacy that can be formalized as generally as circular reasoning would be a formal fallacy. After all, we don't need to know the content of A or B to say that B because A because B is an example of circular reasoning. So I think the reason why circular reasoning is not considered a formal fallacy is because if it were, that would immediately raise red flags because of the way in which it would blatantly conflict with other logical principles. Modus ponens, for example, states that if A implies B, if A, then B. If it rains, the ground will be wet. It's raining, therefore the ground will be wet. If the similarities between modus ponens and circular reasoning aren't immediately clear, then consider the statement A implies B as a proposition in and of itself. In this, we are repeating the same proposition twice. We are saying that if A implies B, then A implies B. or when we consider A implies B as its own statement, we are saying if statement, then statement. And this is a tautology, a statement that must necessarily always be true. So now, I'm not saying that modus ponens and circular reasoning are the same thing. Obviously, for lack of a better, more concise word, modus ponens is hypothetical. We do not need to assume the truth of the premise. We are simply saying that if the statement is true, then it is true. The difference here is that circular reasoning does not say if, and instead simply asserts that the statement is true by reason of it being true. But the reason I am bringing the two up together is that modus ponens affirms that the structure of circular reasoning is valid. If someone begs the question and says A implies A, it's not as though A does not imply A. Again, this, in addition to invalidating modus ponens, would likewise violate the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction. A thing must imply itself. Likewise, we can defend circular reasoning using modus ponens. Abstracting the sentence, "the ground got wet when it rained because the ground gets wet when it rains," reveals that the structure is circular. But despite that, if rain makes the ground wet, then rain does make the ground wet. The premise is sufficient to reason out the conclusion, at least from a structural perspective, because as we'll get to, the claim is that circular reasoning is an informal fallacy. However, the issue with that is that it is not as though a concept can be formally valid, but also an informal fallacy. And so this starts to help us in unraveling the myth of circular reasoning as a fallacy when we consider it in asking the question, what arguments are made for circular reasoning as an informal fallacy? Imaginably, a decent-sounding argument could be that circular reasoning is an informal fallacy because it clearly belongs to the fallacies of presumption or insufficient evidence. We assume that our repeated or circular statement is true when we do not have any valid reason to think that it is true. After all, perhaps an argument you might make as to why I was wrong and that circular reasoning is not structurally sound is because we could make any false statement like the Earth is flat because the Earth is the shape of a flattened disk and say that clearly this premise is not sufficient evidence for its conclusion. And I get where you're coming from, there's something there that's putting you on the right track, but unfortunately, as strange as it sounds, that's not really the case because truth and validity are separate concepts. With our old friend modus ponens, for example, if you insert a false premise, you will get a false conclusion. It rains every Friday, today is Friday, so it will rain. This doesn't make modus ponens invalid, it just means that we put junk in and got junk out. If we put in true premises, we will always get a true conclusion. Not only that, but for example in statements like the sky is blue because it is blue, grass is green because it is green, and the sun is bright because it is bright, for reasons we will touch on later, the fact that the sky is blue is sufficient evidence to conclude that the sky is blue. Grass being green means that it's green, and we can know that the sun is bright because it is. Likewise, even some sources say that circular reasoning can be valid. For example, usually Britannica is generally pretty good at getting things right, but listen to this. While circular reasoning can be a valid argument if both its premise and its conclusion are true, it is a fallacious argument in that it does not stand the test of good reasoning because its premise and conclusion are identical. So circular reasoning can be valid even though it's always a fallacy? Let's just completely skip over that blatant and embarrassing mistake because it gets even worse when you think about it. They say circular reasoning is a fallacy because its premise and its conclusion are identical, which is just another way of saying it is circular. That's what it means to be circular. So, in other words, circular reasoning is a fallacy because it's circular. So Britannica's explanation here is itself circular reasoning. Granted, I should correct myself here because this isn't actually that bad. You can do this, what I'm doing right now, where I'm arguing that their argument is circular, with literally anything else. Any other argument can be argued to be circular. But, I mean, at the same time, that's why I'm saying this is embarrassing. Because you can't make an argument like this. You can't say, oh, well, circular reasoning is a fallacy because it's circular, and not realize the truth that is staring you right in the face. For example, other sources will say that circular reasoning is a pragmatic defect, that it fails to persuade. But that is all despite the fact that they are still trying to contend that it is, in fact, a logical fallacy, but it's clearly not. Whether or not someone is convinced or persuaded by an argument does not make something a logical fallacy. That makes it a rhetorical fallacy. A logical fallacy is a flaw in reasoning. Saying that the sky is blue because it is blue is not a flaw in reasoning, it's just not a very convincing argument. Likewise, when we apply modus ponens to specific specific contexts, we often assume the truth of the premise. We accept, for example, that rain makes the ground wet, such to say that if it rains, the ground will be wet. And so obviously we can do this for more contentious premises. But in that, if someone does not concede to the premise, then the argument does not motivate the conclusion. If you tell a flat earther, for example, that gravity pulls from all directions to make any large object in space spherical, meaning that the Earth, being a large object in space affected by gravity, is thereby round, the flat earther will remain unconvinced by your argument. So, was it circular? Was it a fallacy simply because you asserted a premise that someone else denied? And if there was a theoretical person that denied all premises, would essentially all arguments be fallacies? I think the issue is not putting history into perspective and by virtue of that overemphasizing the importance of old interpretations in relation to incompatible new ones. Is circular reasoning a fallacy in traditional dialectical approaches like when Aristotle first wrote about it? Yes. But is it a fallacy in more modern approaches that try to parse out an understanding of the world devoid of rhetoric? Not really. Although it should be said that in that, the nature of circular reasoning is vastly more complicated. Obviously, as I have said, if the sky is blue, then the sky is blue. This is a truth about reality, and in that, circular reasoning is not ontologically flawed. If something is true in reality, then it is true. The issue with this, however, is that even though our statements are often about reality, they also implicitly contain a claim of our knowledge about reality. If I tell you that grass is green, it is either because I believe or I know that grass is green, and I'm trying to share that knowledge with you so that you know it as well. I'm trying to prove it, which means that it is something I can know and I can prove to you. By this standard, circular reasoning fails in some ways because if I begin at my conclusion, then that requires you to already know the conclusion in order to learn the conclusion. This clearly gives us no way for the conclusion to ever be proven to you, and likewise, I would have no way of claiming that I myself know the conclusion. And what this means for classical dialectics, I'm not really going to try to get into. Maybe there was a good reason for once classifying circular reasoning as a fallacy, but in the case of Aristotle, and more generally in cases of philosophers like him, people tend to take things out of context, make a Wikipedia article about it, and then suddenly everybody believes this out-of-context claim and treats it as gospel, rather than understanding the nuance behind it that delves into the limitations of a given topic. For example, you may have noticed that I said circular reasoning fails in some ways, which implies that it does not do so for all. While I think it more or less fairly conveys the idea to say that circular reasoning is epistemologically flawed, there's an interesting caveat to this. If epistemologically we need a starting point such to be able to grasp a concept in order to prove it, what is that starting point? If we can't repeat propositions without creating a circular chain, then clearly the basis for our conclusion has to be linear, either like this or like this. Either way, the prerequisites, as we have it here, stretch back to beginning points. But if they end, that is, if they go back to these beginning points, then how can we know something without some basis for it to be explained? In having beginning points, we just arrive back at the problem we started with. So they can't have beginning points. They can't end, but if they don't, and they keep going on forever, then each subsequent question sends us back to the next. This is a problem that has popped up several times in the field of epistemology and is often called Munchausen's trilemma. The claim, generally, is that no matter what, you're always going to be left with three seemingly equally bad options. You can either make circular arguments, you can make baseless arguments from axioms, or you can chase your own tail endlessly in an infinite regress. Often, as I understand it, this concept is used to cast doubt on our ability to draw conclusions and make knowledge claims. But I would argue that this goes to show that circular reasoning is far more nuanced than just being a fallacy, because it is no more or less flawed than any other basis for an epistemological framework. I would really only say that an infinite regress is the only concept here that cannot instantiate a knowledge claim, because it is the only system that would not hold itself to be true. Most clearly, if you accept axioms, then you accept axioms. You just start at an axiom and work your way forward. As we'll get to, if you accept circularity, then you accept circularity. However, if you find yourself journeying on an infinite regress, it is only because you are operating under the assumption that each element needs a previous one, looking for a starting point to work your way back, despite the fact that the regress never ends, and by virtue of that, can never offer up a way to make a knowledge claim. Although I take that with a grain of salt because in mathematics, you can find an answer to an infinite series or an infinite sum if it converges. So, for example, through something like information theory, you could imagine that in an infinite regression, you go on and there's less and less information each and every time. And by virtue of that, you can sort of find what the limit is of that series, the truth by approximation. But then that still gets into the very important question of how are you even reasoning any of this out if we're asking the question of how do we know things such to even reason any of this out? And that, I think, lends more credence to presumptive systems like axiomatic systems and circular systems. Because, for example, how could we claim that Munchausen's trilemma is a problem that speaks to our inability to form epistemological systems as if it isn't predicated on knowledge claims and aims to make a knowledge claim? And so here, I think, ironically, the typical analogy of a writer trying to pull up the horse he is riding, which is used to depict Munchausen's trilemma, actually shows us how to offer up two solutions to the trilemma. One, necessary truths. Typically, this is how believers of axiomatic systems will offer up a resolution. For example, Descartes' I think therefore I am is thought of, at least by rationalists, as an irrefutable truth that can stand on its own merit. I wouldn't necessarily contest this, but it comes down to conceptualization and owes acknowledgement to a more nuanced interpretation. I think therefore I am can only be known if the experience of thought takes place. A thing that is not aware of itself would not know its own existence, which means self-observation is necessary to motivate the claim. This isn't to claim that this rationalist argument is actually empirical in nature. Like I said, I think we just have to acknowledge the more nuanced reality of the situation. If truth means that something is in accordance with reality, then in order for statements to be true and for knowledge claims to be possible, statements have to have this relationship with reality, which is to say that our second solution is observation and verification. Just as we know that a rider cannot lift his own horse because of knowledge based on life experience that we have, we know what a horse is, we know what a rider is, we know what it means for a rider to ride a horse, we can make observations about reality in order to give our statements an objective basis. Which isn't to say that every statement must be observed or verified. If our statements are consonant with, or in other words, mere reality, and reality is consonant with itself, then by necessity our statements imply each other, because just as reality is consistent, a set of true statements about reality will be consistent as well. And so here we get circularity not as a logical fallacy, but as probably one of the most important and valid epistemological concepts, because what you would call circular reasoning, here we see in this context is actually just called logical consistency. And so here the issue should become apparent that accusing observational statements and definitions of being circular is meaningless because all statements have an indirect relationship with all other statements, just as all aspects of reality indirectly affect one another in a closed system. After all, if they didn't, then some element of reality would be detached from reality, or in other words, a separate reality. So take for example something like a somewhat recent political issue like the question, what is a woman? People with more traditional views on gender use this as a takedown of moderate left and far left views on gender because, especially among the far left, the response would just be, a woman is someone who feels like a woman, to which conservatives and traditionalists would claim victory by virtue of the circular nature of the argument being made. The issue, however, is that this immediately came back to bite conservatives because leftists realized that they could just turn around and ask the same exact question. They would ask, what is a woman? And then conservatives would say a female. Leftists would ask, what is a female? And conservatives would reply, a person with female reproductive organs. To which the leftists, using the poor standards of the right, would claim their victory. Here we define woman as a female, and we then defined a female in terms of being a female. This is because all definitions on a conceptual level are circular. It is only when we consider that these concepts do not just exist on a conceptual or word level, but are meant to mirror reality that we understand the differences between the two arguments being made by the two ideologies. On the right, they are saying that a woman is someone with female reproductive organs, and this is meant to reference reality, not just stay on the conceptual level. Moderate and moderate left-wing positions on gender can do the same. Whether you agree with this or whether this is correct or not, they can say that a woman is someone who demonstrates effeminate traits, both physically and psychologically, and participates in effeminate gender roles. The far left, however, maintaining that gender is whatever a person wants it to be, does not and cannot reference anything in reality, as by definition, gender is a subjective claim under their ideology. And so, ultimately, this is the difference. objective versus subjective, not circular versus non-circular, because all arguments are circular. Or at least all arguments can be considered circular, because some may say that we have a straight through line here from woman to female through observation that does not require any other statement. However, I think this neglects the concession we made earlier. If reality is consonant, our statements are as well. Our arguments may be used as linear symbols directly referencing reality, but they are still also words on a screen that reference each other. So this axiomatic interpretation neglects that if our statements mirror reality, then there is a sort of dualism that our words possess. When I say the sky is blue because the sky is blue, do you have any way of knowing if I'm just repeating a conceptual statement twice? Or if I'm verifying the conceptual statement with an observation? Or is there really even a difference between the two? After all, we can't speak in physical things themselves. We think in the concepts that represent these things, and the words we use to represent those concepts. In that, all reasoning is circular. So it's a bit silly to say that circular reasoning is a logical fallacy. Yes, this is a pretty complicated topic if you couldn't tell, so interpretation in this case may be in many ways left up to opinion. And in that, unfortunately, I can't tie this one up in a neat little bow and tell you what you can do and what you can't do and what's acceptable and what's not. Which, depending on who you are, may actually be fortunate if, for example, you hate when I condescendingly say that a concept lacks logical merit, because that isn't the case here. People are right in realizing that circular reasoning is a complicated issue in which there are things you can do that are wrong, but it's more sophisticated than just being a straightforward logical fallacy. What I've said here has to do more with what branch of philosophy this concept actually deals with, rather than whether or not people are misusing this concept. Yes, you can say someone who makes explicitly circular arguments is making a rhetorically and epistemologically flawed argument. It is impossible to prove something if you first have to prove it. It is impossible to know something if you first have to know it. But at the same time, it's not as though arguments can never be circular. So I think if I had to give a concise summary of what you need to understand about circular reasoning, it is that it is more about understanding the nature of circularity in a specific instance. Not just circular versus non-circular. You need to think, is this objective or is it subjective? And are a set of ideas consistent with each other in which they could be true, but they don't necessarily have to be? Or are they inconsistent or rely on each other in some vicious way? Is there a way that you can get into the circle through something like observation, or is it a circle that insists upon itself? In which, yes, then circularity is a problem. But it's really just a per-case basis. One thing that is not a per-case basis, though, and I didn't know where to put this in this video, it's kind of annoying when people take the colloquialism, it begs the question, and then they're like, actually, it doesn't beg the question, it raises the question. Like, the entire reason the philosophical concept of begging the question is a problem is because it leaves a question unanswered. That's why it's called begging the question. So when people take that and use that as an idiom to say it raises a question, you're not correcting them, you're just being annoying. So if you ever want to be invited to parties, stop that. Because otherwise people are going to think that you're a whiny, annoying little bitch